ወደ ቻናላችን ተከታታዮች ከዚህ ቀጥሎ በመናቀርበው ቪዲዮ ታዋቂው ፕሮፌሰር ጄሪ ማርቲንስኪ ባደረጉት ምርምር እንዴት አድርገው ሰዎችን በተለያየ በሪሊጂን ወይም ደግሞ በሃይማኖታዊ አስተሳሰብ እና በተለያየ መንገድ አፈታሪክ የሚመስሉ ነገሮችን እንደ ማስክ በመጠቀም ወይም ሪሊጂን እንደ ማስክ በመጠቀም ሰዎች ላይ የሚጣበቁ መንፈሶች ሰዎችን ወይም የተጣበቁባትን ወይም የተጣበቁበትን ሰው ለማታለል የሚጠቀሙበትን የተለያዩ ትሪክሶች ወይም ማታለያ ነገሮችን መንገዶችን ያሳዩ ሲሆን ከነኚህም ውስጥ አንዱና ዋነኛው ሰውየው ወይም ሴትዮዋ ከህፃንነት ጀምሮ የሚያውቁትን ነገር በባህላዊ አስተሳሰብ ይሁን በሃይማኖታዊ ወይም ከእድገታቸው ከህፃንነት ከቤተሰባቸው የሚያውቁትን የድሮ ታሪክ በህልማቸው ያመጡ እያሳዩ ወይም በተለያየ መንገድ ሰዎችን እያሳዩአቸው ሰዎችን በቃ እኔ እግዚአብሔር ነኝ ወይም እኔ እንደዚህ ነኝ ብሎ እንዲያምኑ ማድረግና በዛ ውስጥ ሰዎቹ እንደዛ አይነት እንትኖች ከከተቱ በኋላ ሰዎቹ ህይወታቸው ወይም ሴትዮዋ ወይም ሰውየው ህይወታቸው በጣም ኮንትሮቨርሻል ሆነ ችግር ውስጥ እንደሚወድቅና የሳይኮሎጂ ችግር ውስጥ እንደሚወድቅ ይናገራሉ። በተለይ በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ብዙ እግዚአብሔር ወይም ደግሞ አምላክ ሹካለኝ የሚሉ ሰዎች እንደዚህ አይነት የሲሾፍሬኒክ የሆነ የአታቺንግ ስፒሪት ሽወዳ ተጠቂ ናቸው። ይህንን ነገር ግን እነኚህ ሰዎች የሚያዩበት የአስተሳሰቡም ሆነ የአመለካከቱ አማራጭ ስለሌላቸው ነገሩን ሁሉ በብላክ ኤንድ ዋይት ወይም ደግሞ እግዚአብሔርና ሰይጣን ብለው ስለሚያዩት ብዙ እንደሚሸወዱና ብዙ ችግር ውስጥ እንደሚወድቁ ያሳያል። የዚህ ቪዲዮ ዓላማ ሰዎች እንዲህ አይነትን ነገር ከኔ ውጪ የሆነ ሌላ ኃይል ሊሸውደኝ መጥቶ ምን እየሰራ ነው እየተጫወተ ነው የሚለውን ጥያቄ ተጠይቀው ራሳቸውን ከእንደዚህ አይነት ሽወዳ ነፃ እንዲያወጡና ይህን ነገር እንዲያውቁበት ለማስተማር ታስቦ የተሰራ ነው። በዛሬ በውጭው ዓለም በተለያዩ ፖድካስቶች በተለያዩ ሚዲያዎች እንደዚህ የምርምር ውጤቶች ስለቀረቡ ብዙ በዌስተርን ዓለም ላይ ሰዎች አይሸወዱም። ኢትዮጵያም ውስጥ ይህ እውቀት በስፋት ገብቶ ሰዎች ከዚህ ሽወዳ እንዲወጡ በማሰብ የሚለቀቅ ቪዲዮ ነው። ተመልከቱት፣ አዳምጡት የፕሮፌሰሩን መልእክት።
These entities have access to your mind, and I've seen them go in there and pull up bad things that patients have done decades ago that they'd forgotten about long ago, and these things will dredge it up and rub it in their face. So if the person starts with a negative self-concept, like a lot of these schizophrenics do, then they're seeking a reinforcement of that, you know. And these things go in there and they will insert thoughts into the person's mind to inflame those wounds. And what they do is they feed off of the negative emotional energy that is generated from those negative thoughts. That's their food source. They can't produce that themselves, and then they suck that off.
Hello everyone, that was a clip from today's interview with guest Jerry Mazinski. As a psychotherapist, Jerry spent decades working in hospitals and the US prison system, focusing particularly on people suffering with schizophrenia. His observations and interactions led him to some unorthodox opinions about the nature of the voices that torment people suffering of that condition, and that, as we've just heard, they are parasitic entities external to the person that are generating and then feeding off negative emotional energy. Jerry wasn't able to talk about this openly during his career, but has given several interviews since his recent retirement. I've been avidly listening to these and building up a whole load of questions I wanted to put to him. First and foremost, I wanted to know about the treatment programs he developed based upon this interpretation and the effect they'd had in freeing people from hearing these tormenting voices. I also wanted to know what insight Jerry had gained into the nature of these entities. Were they demons, lost souls, hungry ghosts? Is it possible to say? And to their ability to use deception and counterfeit spiritual experiences to present themselves as spirit guides or ascended masters and effectively con people. I also asked Jerry the question that inevitably arises once we acknowledge the existence of such entities. That is, do they just act on an individual level, or do they have a greater global agenda? Now, we recorded for 3.5 hours, so to make it manageable, I'm cutting straight into the main body of the interview. Jerry told a couple of stories of incidents that convinced him the voices were coming from an external source, and I've put them up as bonus clips on this playlist. I didn't go into as much detail of Jerry's biography as he has done in other interviews because I wanted to focus on these special questions, but I did ask him about how he developed this anti-authoritarian outlook in his early life and became cynical of both state and medical authority, and I put that in as a bonus clip too, along with some of his early explorations of the ideas of Carlos Castaneda. Now, finally, whilst I think everyone in this area will find something of insight in Jerry's observations, I appreciate not everyone will agree with all the points he makes. Jerry's offered to come back on and address any questions that arise, so if you have any disagreements, questions, anything like that, please do send them to me and I'll be glad to put them to him. So here's Jerry beginning by explaining how he lost faith in the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness.
Here I am watching the psychiatrist at the hospital just dose these guys with these hardcore antipsychotic drugs, which are major tranquilizers. And, you know, I'd ask him, I said, you know, what causes schizophrenia? And they all, virtually all of them said it's a chemical imbalance of the brain. But I noticed that they never, ever gave any lab tests to check on any kind of chemical imbalance of anything. They had no tests that they gave. It was more like a shotgun thing. They'd try one drug. If that didn't work, they'd try another until they found one that seemed to work the best, but never did they measure anything. And I'm thinking, well, if it's a chemical imbalance, how do they know what's out of balance by how much? You know, truth is they didn't. They had no idea. Yeah, that chemical imbalance theory had to get rid of that because it was holding up further progress. As long as you believed in that, and that's what all the nurses believed, that's what all the counselors believed, that's what the psychologists believe, and it wasn't true. You know, matter of fact, there's you know, I have article after article here that about how much nonsense it actually is. But I saw for myself that they never measured anything. I found out later they had no idea what the neurotransmitter composition of the brain should be. None, zero. You know, they didn't know what the balance should be. They didn't even know how much it was even there. They had no way to measure it. So it was a bunch of crap. And I found out they're selling $3.5 billion of antipsychotic drugs a year based on this chemical imbalance theory. So and if you look at their advertisements, they'll say, oh yeah, serotonin is, the serotonin's out of balance and these drugs put it back in balance. You go look on their sites right now. And then you look up the research and it's total bunk. You know, they're making a fortune off of that lie. So, yeah, here I'm not trusting the psychiatrists now and what they're saying. And then I found that these schizophrenics all at one point or another stopped taking their meds. You know, it's like they were choosing to go psychotic. And I'm like, why are they choosing to go psychotic? Why do they stop taking their meds? The meds were the only things that kept them sane. So I started asking them questions. Why'd you stop taking your meds? First thing was side effects. You know, well, we didn't like the side effects. You know, and the side effects they're horrible. They're not good. But if you look at what psychosis is and how bad it actually is, it's terrible. I mean, it's like hell on earth. So after getting this back from a bunch of patients, oh, well, I stopped taking it because of the rotten side effects. So what I did is I did an experiment. I got a whole listing, went to the DSM and wrote down all the attributes of psychosis, all the horrible things, the hallucinations, the nightmares, the night terror, I mean, all the horrible things. And then I gave them a blank sheet of paper on the ones who had quit their meds and had been put back on them. I'd pull all those guys back in and say, okay, why'd you stop taking your meds? Oh, I didn't like the side effects. Okay, write down on this blank sheet of paper all the side effects that you experienced, because they didn't experience all of them. So they would write down, 5 or 6 or 7, and they weren't good. Dry tongue, sexual dysfunction, dry mouth, feeling groggy. They're not good. Nobody in their right mind would take those drugs at all. I mean, nobody would take them if they didn't have to. And then I gave them this list of psychotic symptoms. I said, check all the ones that you've experienced. And here they are, horrible. And then I would give them both to them, and I would say, which one is worst? Consistently, every single one said going psychotic is worst. And then I'd say, well, then why do you stop taking your drugs? I mean, I said, I can understand why you do it maybe the first time, because you would think that, maybe you could get away with it, or you were getting better, or that it was like taking an aspirin for a headache or something. It would make, no, the psychiatrist already told you that's not the case. That if you stop taking these, you'd get crazy again. So this is the third time you went off your meds. Why did you do it again? And I questioned scores of them, the same process. And every single one said, I don't know. That went on for like 2 years. They didn't know why they were doing that. And then one day, one of the gals she was schizophrenic, she got in trouble because it was like her third time going off of meds, and they were about to kick her out of the program because she was non-compliant with her meds. Her mother called me from South Georgia and said, you can't send her back here. I can't deal with her. You're the only people that have even gotten her into any kind of half-decent shape. If she comes back here, I know what's going to happen. So she said, I want to come up and talk to you. I want to talk to both of you. We need to get her to graduate. So I said, well, that's fine. Come on up, and I'll meet you this Friday. We'll bring her in and talk to her. So we brought her in, and she's doing good while she was on her meds. Brought her in, brought her mother in, and her mother and I are both looking at her. And I'd already run her through this thing. And she said, I don't know why, why I did this. And her mother's beseeching her, why do you keep going off your meds? And I said, yeah, tell us, why do you keep going off your meds? And I said, they're about to kick you out of the program. And she said, because the voices told me that the psychiatrist is poisoning me. And they said that the side effects of the meds are proof that I'm being poisoned. And that kind of blew my head. I'm like, holy cow. Then what clicked into place was the assault rate on psychiatrists. The assault rate on psychiatrists is it's like 10 times higher than on regular doctors, and it's equal to attendant staff who are with these patients 24 hours a day. So I started asking other patients, why? Does the voices have anything to do with this? And some of them said, yeah, they're the ones that told me I'm being poisoned, that the psychiatrist is poisoning me. And that was a common complaint. And that's one of the reasons why the psychiatrists are getting crap kicked out of them. So what do the psychiatrists do that other mental health staff don't? Is they dish out these meds. And these meds don't cure them, but they do weaken the voices. So they're a threat to the voices. So in order to move on to methods to deal with the voice, I mean, the voices are horrible. They're horrible. They will say every rotten thing. They have complete access to your memory. They can pull up every rotten thing you've ever done and rub it in your face forever. They hardly ever say anything positive. And if they do, it's to hook you into something later on that would be bad. Okay? So if they were hallucinations, it's like, why are they consistently negative? Hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're neutral, they're all over. They make no sense. They don't run any pattern. These things are consistently negative. They run a consistently negative pattern, and they don't deviate from that. The question then is, what holds them to this pattern? It's like you have water in a jar. What holds that water in that jar? There's something holding them to that pattern. I had no idea what it was, but something was. Right? So the first thing is to get the patients to tell me what the voices are saying. And I got in a lot of trouble at the state hospital for asking patients what their voices were saying, because they would get upset. The voices would get upset at me. I didn't know that at this time, but they would get upset over being asked these questions. And when psychiatrists found out that I was asking them about their voices, I got pulled up before them a couple of times and kind of warned and threatened, you stop this immediately. these are hallucinations, and you're reinforcing them with your questions like they're real. You're making the patient worse. You're upsetting my patients, and I don't need that. These are hallucinations. You know? So that was it. They was kind of like, don't even ask them. So I saw that the meds weakened them. And a lot of the patients were running around with headphones on, like, you know, listening to the stereo to drown them out.
Okay.
You know, so while they're blasting this music, they're not hearing the voices. So I went, well, that's interesting. The other thing was that the voices weren't like word salad. They weren't just like crazy words that made no sense. Whatever this thing was speaking to them was speaking to them in coherent, full sentences with full thoughts. And you could overhear them talking to these voices. And it was, like I said, it was like, you know, you're hearing one side of a telephone conversation, and the patients would argue with these voices and cuss at them and you know, shut up. And it's like you're hearing, it wasn't word salad. So whatever these things were, they were speaking in complete, coherent sentences, although for a long time I didn't know what those sentences were. I was constantly, you know, asking questions as to what was being said. The messages were constantly abusive against the patient and everybody else. They were telling, you know, hit this guy, he's insulting you. I mean, it was always negative stuff. And I suspected because the medicines would weaken the voices. If the guy were listening to the stereo, he wouldn't be as affected by these voices. I started to suspect it was the voices that drove this psychosis. So I started playing with that. And it's like, okay, I started telling patients, do the opposite of what they're telling you to do. And I got into trouble with that at the state hospital too. So after I got out of the PhD program, went to work in the psych department of a big state prison. I collected up a number of schizophrenic prisoners who we had to form a trust, because that was real touchy. You know, here's a prisoner telling me that his voices are telling him to, you know, beat me up or kill me. And he had the trust that I wasn't going to turn him in and get him locked up for that. Mm-hmm. So it was a constant balancing thing. Like, how can I get this information without risking myself or the prisoner and keep that trust bond going? And at what point will I have to act to stop him from doing something dangerous? So I would set out the ground rules to start with. I said, I won't have you locked up as long as you're not an imminent threat to yourself or anybody else. Those are the ground rules. Mm-hmm. You know, so if you're not going to be able to hold, you tell me that and we'll deal with that. You know, but I'm not going to just have you locked up for saying, you know, the voices are telling you this or that. So we worked that out. That took a while. I always had a group of trusted schizophrenic prisoners around me who would tell me in real time what their voices were saying while I was talking to them, and what effect what I was saying to them had on the voices, and what the voices were telling them when they were gone, what the voices were telling them with regard to the homework that I gave them. So I was getting all this information in, and you know, a patient complaining about the voices bitching because of stuff that I'm telling them to do didn't even come near the ambient noise level in the prison. I mean, they wouldn't even be listened to. I mean, that was the least of security's worries. So here I am listening to them tell me all these rotten things that the voices are telling them to do, say, act, manipulate, and it's all this bad stuff.
Jerry, can you just explain to me, why would the sufferers of this do what the voices were telling them? Did they believe it would bring them some relief, or that the voices were on their side in some way? Because I'm just thinking, if someone's telling me all this horrible stuff about myself all the time, I'm not inclined to do what they then tell me to do. So what kind of hold did the voices have over them to coerce their actions?
Well, there's two things. Is most of and I'd say the majority of schizophrenic patients that I've worked with were horribly sexually, emotionally, or physically abused as children. You know, they came out of horribly negative, abusive relationships. And here's these relationships blaming them. I mean, the sexual predators would say, it's your fault. You're the one who seduced me into this. And the emotionally abusive parent would say, you're no good, you're rotten, you know, look at this as a, you know, and the physically abusive, you know, well, you don't listen, you're stupid, I beat the crap. So they already have that programmed in. And that's like a radio signal to these entities. So each of us is broadcasting on a frequency. So you can look at your mind as like a transmitter. You're transmitting your thoughts out into the universe. And those entities that are in tune with those thoughts are attracted to that. And you can see that with people. You know, the school guys hang out with the school guys, and the physicists hang out with the physicists, and the spiritual guys hang out with the physicists. They're attracted to one another. Same thing in the physical world or the spiritual world. You're always broadcasting thoughts. You're always putting them out there. And these thoughts attract from the universe the entities that are like that.
Okay, so there's two things going on. There's the person's innate kind of negative perceptions about themselves coming from a traumatic experience, and then there's the bully that moves in that sense. And you can see this also, like obviously, as you say, in human relationships, that people who have a very low sense of self-esteem will often get into an abusive relationship with a narcissistic partner.
And, you know, like a woman will choose an alcoholic time after time after time.
So then you've got that playing out on a psychical level too.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So you got that going on, and then these voices are relentless. You know, they're relentless. And the problem is that most people in the world right now believe that they are their thoughts. There's nothing further from the truth. If you're your thoughts, then who is listening to those thoughts? We're not our thoughts. Our thoughts come from the programming we've had as a kid, the programming from school, the program from what we learned in life. So we have our own story. And that what we do is we look for information that reinforces our story. You know? So you see this, and oh yeah, that reinforces what I believe. That, but all these weird things that come in there, you know, that plop in, it's like, oh, that doesn't fit. You know, so you blow that out because it doesn't fit in with your story. So you're constantly telling yourself your own story, and when you're done, the world is like you think it is.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense as to why people would obey the voices or the thoughts. Because I mean, I've done meditation sessions with people, and just the insight gained that there's something deeper to a person than their own thoughts can be an immense relief. Just because if you believe you are your thoughts, there's a tendency to think the thoughts are true. Okay, and to be able to step back and say, oh, it's a thought, it's a voice, whatever. It's not necessarily true. Could be true, could be false. We'd have to look, but it's not me in some way. So that makes sense of my question.
That is critical. That is absolutely critical. These entities have access to your mind. And I've seen them go in there and pull up bad things that patients have done decades ago that they'd forgotten about long ago. And these things will dredge it up and rub it in their face. So if the person starts with a negative self-concept, like a lot of these schizophrenics do, then they're seeking a reinforcement of that. You know? And these things go in there and they will insert thoughts into the person's mind to inflame those wounds. Now what they do is they feed off of the negative emotional energy that is generated from those negative thoughts. That's their food source. They can't produce that themselves, and then they suck that off. And I've seen that time after time. For years, I saw a one-to-one correlation between the voices attacking these guys and their energy disappearing to such an extent that they couldn't even get out of bed. You know? And all they were doing all night is just laying in bed. And you'd ask them, well, you know, what's going on? They didn't know. I thought for years that it was the anxiety from these thoughts that are horrible that did that caused that energy drain. And I clearly saw that energy drain. It was happened every single time the voices appeared. I didn't know what caused it. I assumed it was the massive amount of anxiety that these things created, until one day I was working, they put me over, I had the most difficult units almost all the time. They put me over to jail for the prison, which this is the worst of the worst. So all the bad guys from the whole prison would be locked up in this place. This is the worst of the worst. There were two guys locked together. One was one who he snitched off the gangsters, and the gangsters had stabbed him already, and they were trying to kill him. They wanted him dead so bad because he ruined their drug deal, that they sent guys in there who got in trouble on purpose so they could get at this guy and kill him. You couldn't be under much more stress. Now you add to that the fact that he's locked into a cell with a florid psychotic who's crazy as a bedbug, hearing voices, pacing the room all night, talking to himself, and then standing and staring over him at 3 in the morning. He's staring down at the guy, and the guy wakes up and he sees this crazy guy looking down at him. You know, you can't get under too much more stress than that. The crazy guy wasn't on enough meds. And he was just floridly psychotic. The captain of the Central Detention Unit called me up, said, you got to come over here and do something about this. You know, these guys are, this is a mess over here. It's going to explode. So I called him in. I pulled up the guy who the gangsters wanted to kill first and watch him walk up the steps of the. He just flew up those steps. I mean, he didn't have any trouble with energy at all. He just beamed. You know, he came in and he was coherent. He had plenty of energy to talk. His speech was normal. I mean, he had plenty of energy. He had some problems. He had some serious problems. You couldn't get under more stress than he did. So after I wrote down, you know, what was going on and told him I'd see what I could do to get him moved somewhere else, I pulled in his psychotic roommate. That guy barely made it up the steps. He just drug up the steps very slowly, and just kind of shuffled into the office, sat down. He didn't have any energy. He talked slow, and I'm like, after I watched those two guys and experienced those two guys, I knew that it wasn't the anxiety that was causing that energy drain. So I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz, who's a shaman, who was talking about this energy drain. And I'm like, this is the same thing I'm seeing with these psychotic prisoners. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So I'll just stop there because I picked that up later on. So at that point, I knew it was not the anxiety.
Okay. Well, regarding interacting then, I mean, just on the energy drain thing, I don't know if this is relevant, but it brings to mind, I did an experiment when I was younger I went through a process of like mental hygiene, okay, where I became aware that I'd fallen into, through my teenage years, very negative patterns of thinking, going through high school, quite critical of people around me and ultimately myself. And I went through a period of like cleaning that up, if you like, and getting rid of this kind of negative patterns. And after doing that for a while, I just started to play with what negative thoughts feel like. So I'd think something really critical about someone, or like swearing or something gross or something like that. And then I'd become still and monitor the effect that had on my mind. And I felt this almost like slight sense of levity as the negative thought form formed and was expressed. And then this kind of crashing feeling. I mean, I could compare it to a sugar high almost. You know, you get that slight kind of rush, and it's like, oh, I wish I'd done that. And it was that, and that was a big kind of. I'm glad I went back and did that, because it was really tangible, the effect of kind of toxic thoughts on the psyche, how it drags a person down.
Every single one does that. Now, when you have a schizophrenic whose whole life is composed of that, they don't have any energy. They have none.
So we'll go on to talking about like how you engaged with this. But I want to ask, in terms of this resonance with entities, is it clear to you, and does it ultimately matter, whether there's something we could consider external to the self there or not. Like, could we know that? Because just as I mentioned before, before we started recording, I've done meditative sessions with people looking at where the sense of self arises from, where different voices arise from in consciousness, and playing with that sense of self. So what if we recast the thoughts that say, I'm disgusting, I'm worthless, I'm useless, as you're disgusting, you're worthless, you're useless? What if we put them into the third person? And often people have a shocking insight and go, oh, it's my mother. I've been carrying my mother around in my head. I've been carrying my gym teacher around in my head for the past 30 years. I can't believe it. How did I never see that? And it feels, whatever it is, it feels like it's a very, could have a very psychological, in one's own mind, explanation. Like this critical voice, for whatever reason, has been internalized at some point. And then, of course, we also have experiences which seem much harder to fit into that category, either because in the direct telling from the person, they're describing something that really seems external or demonic or wicked, and it's just pouring pure bile into them the whole time, or something arises like they gain access to information they couldn't possibly know of themselves. So I think you can clearly see that sometimes these voices are external, but I'm not clear myself on, is that always the case? Is it just sometimes the case? Or some things just a case of people's own inner negativity? So I suppose there's two questions that arise on that from me. The first being, like, do you have a sense of that? I get the sense that you think a lot of it, at the very least, is external. And secondly, does it ultimately matter in terms of engaging in treatment if it's internal or external?
Yeah, it does, because it's both. What you said is true. Yeah, and when you say if you direct the patient to say you're this, and then ask them who in your past said that, that's a good thing, because they will see how they were programmed by that person. Right? So what everybody has is psychological wounds, okay? And a lot of them have been buried alive. So in the case of that fella who goes, hey, that's my mother speaking, he was hammered with all this negative stuff from the mother, which is incorporated into his self-concept. So he already believes that. So what these entities will do is, when he comes into a situation and meets somebody who is similar to his mother, they're going to go in and go, hey, this one's treating you just like your mother. They're telling you this stuff. I mean, and there will be an inflammation of that. Yeah. So they know where your wounds are. And they'll go, hey, look at, and it won't be like, hey, this guy's treating you just like your mother. It'll be this awareness of this emotional explosion to something that approximates what the mother did or said, and this thing will pour gasoline on it and go, yeah, that's right. Look, he's doing the same thing. Kick that bastard in the ass. So they can go in there and they can know all those wounds in your head. And unless you forgive and bring them up and heal them, those things stay, and that's what they feed off. It's like when they say somebody's pushing your button. Okay, that's a program you're already programmed with, and this guy comes in with the key and he knows that, and he pushes your button and you go off. These things do the same thing.
So just to be clear, your perspective is that potentially, like, everyone in the world is affected by this in some degree.
Everyone in the world is affected by this. Every negative thought that you have about yourself or about somebody else is put there by them. And like you found, every negative thought generates a negative emotion. You get that high, like when somebody flies into a rage. While they're in a rage, that feels great. But after they come down, they see all the damage they've done and how bad they made people feel and the trouble they're in. And then you got the down part. Right? So, yeah, you have to understand that you are not your thoughts, and watch them and when you watch them, you'll see they kind of carry you off in this big circle, and then you come back down, and then here's this period of silence where it's just, you're just present. And you can look back and go, well, where did that thought take me? Well, you're thinking about this stupid stuff that you have no control over that just upsets you. So what these things thrive off of is fear, guilt, lust, and greed. They will feed that, and they treat us like we treat cows. Every single thought that comes in, and this happens almost everybody. You're walking along down the sidewalk, and all of a sudden this thought barges into your head that's just totally horrible. And it's like, where did that come from? I would never do anything like that. You feel shameful that you even thought a thought like that. You go, I would never entertain something like that. Well, where did it come from? That's disgusting. And nobody asks, where's that come from?
Okay, just let me inquire a bit deeper about that. The idea that every negative thought, I think I would have a difficulty defining what constitutes a negative thought. For example, like, let's say I'm going to do like a public speaking event, okay? Mm-hmm. And there's this thought in my head going, you're not good enough to do that, or I'm not good enough to do that, right? That could be a negative thought. It could be just this inner critic that's running me down. And as a result of that, maybe I back off from it. I don't take challenges in life. But I find also when I've had that kind of thing and I've engaged with it, it's said like, look, you're not strong enough in this area or something. It's pointed out something like quite useful, okay, through engaging with like what, in a Jungian sense, you could call the shadow or something. It can often be like my inner sense of where I feel weak in something is revealed through doing that. So how are you defining what constitutes a negative thought as opposed to what might be like a sensible level of caution or something like that?
Well, I think what it is the emotion that it generates.
Okay.
I'm a commercial glider pilot, and I fly those big, long, or used to anyway. And there was always, kind of in the back of your mind, it's like, you don't have an engine, and you're flying this thing at 12,000 feet. That's a little nerve-wracking. You don't have a parachute. And it's like, if you start thinking about that stuff instead of thinking about, hey, there's nobody up here. I got the sky's all mine. I got clouds above me. There's no noise. There's no vibration. So what these things, they don't want you to enjoy yourself. They don't want you to have a good time. They don't want you to enjoy life. You're their food source. We're their food source. If we're not having wars and killing each other and fighting one another and invading other countries and stealing from one another and they don't feed. They have to have conflict. They have to have fear. They have to have, so it's the emotional reaction. Now what Sherry did, and you ought to interview her too. She's kind of like my right hand.
Sure.
Man, she's been there. So as a young woman, she fought these voices for years. They almost killed her. So I kind of ran into, I knew her for like 10 years before she told me, hey, I was telling her about one prisoner I was working with at the prison who was interesting. She goes, I know all about that. I know these things. I know these voices. She's one of the most spiritual people I know. I'm like, how could that be? So I started hammering her with all these questions that nobody could answer unless they heard the voices. And she, bam, 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 she was right there. I'm like, I was like stunned after 10 years of knowing her. And she said that one of the main programs she developed, and we were kind of doing the same thing, only mine was a little sloppier than hers. She went, that's a lie. She started That's a Lie program. So every negative thought that comes into your head about yourself, she would say, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. Mm-hmm. That didn't allow them to engage. So what they're doing is they like fish. They go, okay, let me see if I can get emotional reaction from them from this piece of bait, and they'll hit you with with some bull crap. And she'd go, that's a lie. That's a lie. So they could not engage. They only can generate that negative emotional energy if they can hook you. And they hook you through your source, through the wounds that you have psychologically. You know? So if you heal those and you forgive yourself and you forgive others and you work through those, they don't have anything that they can grab onto to torture you with.
Okay, yeah, and I can see if you think this is accurate. Like we mentioned the analogy of a narcissistic parent or partner before. I can see if you're the victim of that kind of abuse from a living human being and you start to internalize that message, maybe the first thing you need to do is say, no, hang on, that's a lie. That's not true. That's not true. I don't believe that. And then also then to address the wound. So how did that play out in your interactions with people in your work, either at the mental hospital or the prison? Did the sufferers come on board with a kind of process of spirituality? Did you develop a program of treatment based along those lines of refuting the voices and healing the underlying wounds?
Well, kind of. So knowing that these things fed on negative emotional energy, okay, and that to us, I mean, to them, we're cows. They can't generate this energy themselves, you know, but they can insert thoughts in our minds that if they hit home, they will generate that negative emotional energy. And it will be just like what you said. Each individual thought has an impact and generates an emotion. So the voices would tell prisoners to do things that would get them in trouble. Okay, they would get them in trouble with other prisoners. They would get them in trouble with guards. They'd get them in trouble. Once they got them in trouble, when they're in trouble, they're generating that negative emotional energy because of the situation they're in. So these entities didn't have to work. They just came and kind of threw a little bit of gas on the fire and, you know, blew it up. I don't know how many of them told me, "Hey, this guard's a jerk. I'm gonna kick his ass." You know, so that's one of those situations. Like I had to determine, well, is he really going to do that, or is he just saying that? So it got touchy sometimes. So once they get you acting in a negative manner that you're in trouble with others, then the negative emotion just keeps going, and they just kind of keep feeding it. And the prison is like a hog's trough of negative emotion. You can just feel it as soon as you walk in that door. It's like, oh, you know. Yeah. So what I started doing is I found out back when I was working at the state hospital that schizophrenics who were in the rehab center, the preacher would have these ice cream socials and free cake and ice cream after church. And I'd noticed that all the patients went down there except for the schizophrenics. And it's like, I saw that week after week after week, and I started asking them about that. Well, you know, free cake and ice cream, you don't get that every day. How come you're not down there? Well, I don't like the church. I don't like the preacher. I don't, you know, they didn't want anything to do with church. You know, and I'm like, well, that's odd. And then I found that the ones who they suspected that these things were evil something, so they started reading the Bible. And I would ask them, well, how'd that go? And they said, well, the voices got louder. They would tell me it's a bunch of crap. One of them, I remember one guy said his voices told him, hey, Jesus Christ couldn't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? And I'm like, that's an interesting comment from what was supposed to be a hallucination. But even then, I didn't want to believe this so strongly that even stuff like that, I would push out and go, well, it could be their subconscious. I mean, it could be something to go on with, you know, my denial system was taking increasingly larger and larger hits, you know. And I saw that these guys were attracted to horror movies. They were attracted to murder mysteries. They were attracted to all this negative stuff, you know, and you go and you look on their nightstands and here's, you know, murder stories and crime stories and so here they are, just instead of reading positive stuff, they're reading all this negative, and I'm like, what's going on there? And then one of them came in one day and he said, hey, I repeated the 23rd Psalm, and the voices reacted like it was they were thrown on a hot frying pan. And I went, well, that's interesting. And I did this one experiment with positive and negative stuff. So I'd pull a verse out of the Bible, and then I'd pull a verse out of, or a paragraph out of one of these horror books, and I'd ask the patient to read it and take it away, and then write down everything he remembered about that paragraph. And then I'd give him the other one, the Bible verse, and remember what, write it down. They remembered twice as much about the negative stuff as they did about the positive stuff. It was almost like there was another mind there that was soaking in that information, and that was consistent. And I found that very odd, but I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Then when this guy said, hey, they hated the 23rd Psalm, they reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. I started giving out
my shepherd, I shall not want. Yeah.
So I'm not particularly religious, but anything that would have an impact on those things, I would use against them. And I didn't have to worry, like in the state hospital, that if I gave them the 23rd Psalm and they started acting flaky, unless they really attacked somebody or something, but they wouldn't do that for this. They'd just get upset. And I found that was consistent, that the voices among a lot of different prisoners hated when they repeated the 23rd Psalm. And the same went for Amazing Grace. And I'm like, what kind of hallucination would hate the 23rd Psalm? But still my denial system is like, well, this could be something to do with their subconscious and how they were raised. And I'll tell you, here I am trying to rationalize it away. And I still, it's another hit to my denial system, which is getting increasingly battered up. But these guys it gave them some sense of control. They could hit back at the voices now. Even though it didn't drive them away, they saw that they were now doing something that affected the voices negatively. It's like they were given a club that they could hit back with for the first time in their lives. So I started handing out the 23rd Psalm. Then the chief psychologist found out about it. I got called up in his office and ordered not to do that anymore, because it was a religious something or other that offended whoever what, but it worked. So then you asked, when did I start reading stuff like 30 Years Among the Dead? Well, what happened at this time, I was working with Wilson Van Dusen after I had some very strange experiences. I contacted him, and he was a clinical psychologist who was the chief psychologist at a private hospital in California. He was an ardent Swedenborgian, and he found that the voices his patient heard matched almost exactly the negative spirits that Emanuel Swedenborg, the Christian mystic, was talking about.
And that's
so when
200-300 years ago, Swedenborg was writing.
Yeah, and I read Swedenborg too, and I found out, yeah, they do match. They're almost exactly the same. They're talking about the same thing. So what he did is he sent me a copy of 30 Years Among the Dead, and I read it, and it was this, I think he was a psychologist who was using static electricity to shock his patients, which drove the voices out of them. And his wife was a psychic. She would pick up on the voices and then talk them into the light. And once that was done, that voice was gone. And I found that intriguing. And then he started sending me all these advertisements for static shock machines. And I'm like, if I did that in prison, they'd fire me, man. I'd be arrested. I can't do that. But I wanted to check out that concept. And I'm kind of racking my brain for months about what could I do to simulate that shock. So what I found is that the voices made the prisoners that I gave the 23rd Psalm to, they made them forget to repeat it. So they could be carrying it around their pocket. The voices would start up and they would forget all about it. So it was a couple of months down the line. I was talking to a secretary, and here's this big rubber band sitting on her desk, and I looked at it, and I'm staring at it, and I'm like, maybe, maybe. So I grabbed that rubber band, and one of the prisoners I was working with heard voices who I'd already given the 23rd Psalm to. Said, put this around your wrist, and when the voices come, snap it, then repeat the 23rd Psalm. And I said, come on back to me next week and tell me what happened. And he said that when he snapped that rubber band on his wrist, when the voices started, and he repeated the 23rd Psalm, he could remember it. The voices actually shut up when he snapped it. Okay. Once they shut up, he could repeat the Psalm. Mm-hmm. And I started handing out rubber bands to all these guys, and they were snapping their wrists, and some of them came in with their wrists red, from snapping the rubber band. And that was something else. This was in the starting edges, where what can we do? And anything that I could find that would work against these voices, I would try it if I could get away with it. So the chief psychologist caught me again, handing out rubber bands, and got end up in front of his office. Okay, what are you doing now? You stop that crap. What are you doing all this weird crap for? And it's like, I'm warning you. I'm like, oh, shit. I go like, but it shuts the voices up. I don't care. You stop doing that. Oh Lord, So, here's inch by inch by inch, and then came the aspect of intent. So I'd be talking to these prisoners who were listening to their voices when they got in trouble and arrested and thrown into prison, and I would ask them, you were listening to your voices when you did that thing, weren't you? And you go, well, yeah, I was. I said, was it your intent to get thrown into prison? They go, no, it wasn't my intent. I said, well, then whose intent was it? They'd sit there and go, it was theirs. Or if it wasn't mine, then whose was it? And what were you listening to? So here comes like, okay, whose intent was it? The patient has his intention, and these things have their intention. And once you look at it that way, you see that the intention of the voices is not the intention of the victim. Mm-hmm. And you point that out to them. So here's all these pieces, that that are like this giant puzzle that I knew were important pieces, but I didn't know how they fit together at all. So, when that one girl said, well, it's the voices told me to stop taking my meds, it's like a chunk of that puzzle started coming together. Your next question was, what made you believe you were dealing with separate entities? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things is like, I suspected that at the state hospital, from the questions I asked, but I didn't really believe it. My denial system was pretty well beat up, but I left the state hospital for the PhD program still kind of, I don't know exactly what these things were. But then there was another thing where I actually prayed to experience them, and I was sent one experience, and the voices sounded just like my thoughts that I have in my head the entire time. But I won't go into the details of it. It's the bottom of the lake thing. But I was shocked to find out that they sounded just like my everyday thoughts.
Okay.
Like all the millions of thoughts that I have running through my head every day, they sounded just like that. But the information they were giving me, I absolutely knew was bogus and dangerous. There was no doubt in my mind. But what surprised me was how they sounded. There wasn't any change of timbre or volume, or they sounded just like your regular thoughts. Only the content was dangerous. Right? No, I won't go any past that.
Oh, but okay, it's just worth noting that they then can be experienced as an external voice, because schizophrenics are hearing a voice as if it was as real as anyone else speaking.
Yes, and what
or it can be experienced as your own internal voice, but it's essentially it's the same thing. Yes. It produces the same phenomenon.
Exactly. What I found was that when they're very strong and they no longer fear being interfered with, they will move outside the patient's head and talk to him just like you're hearing my voice. And that really freaks them out and scares them, because now they know that it is not them, that it is something else, and that they're hearing it outside of their head like you're hearing my voice. You know, it's not in their head anymore. And they only do that when they're strong enough that where they're not worried about being taken down anymore. You know? And I found that pretty interesting. So, you know, I would do this over and as I discovered each one of these little things that inmates could do based on the feedback I was getting back to interfere with their bombarding the inmate with all these negative crap, and would encourage the inmate to do actually the opposite. And I had it packed with these special inmates I was working with. There was maybe 10 or 15 that if ever anything happened that they didn't seem to be able to control, that I would get them in as soon as I could. Oh, they just come and rap on my window, and I'd get them in as soon as I could after that. So while I was questioning these guys about, you know, what the voices were telling them, and I'd ask them specific questions, the voices would come up and say, and this is on a number of them, they'd say, "Don't tell him any more. He already knows too much." And they would tell me that the voices just told them that. And you know, it's kind of like warped my head. And even then, I would not conceive or admit that these things were something separate, even then, you know. So my denial system was in tatters, and it was still holding up. And that happened 3 or 4 times, where the voice would come up with different patients, say, "Don't tell him anything more. He already knows too much." Almost the same wording, you know. And I'm kind of going, is a hallucination telling them this? And even so, I still would not concede that these were something different. So then a series of events happened leading up to the complete collapse of my denial system. As I was working with one prisoner who was getting better and better and better, as he's leaving one day, he turns in the doorway after the session. He stops and he looks at me and he goes, "You realize what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I look up at him and I like, yeah, I'd never thought of it. I'm kind of like, you know, these things are in your head. They're not, I didn't say this to him, but I'm thinking, you know, these things are in your head, not mine. You know, they can't come out. They're stuck in there. You know, that's it. They're in you. They're not in me, whatever they are. You know, so I wasn't worried about it. And I just kind of looked at him and go, oh, I wonder what made him say that. And then he turned around and he walked away. And it struck me as pretty strange, but I wasn't really worried about it. But I didn't forget it either. You know, so working with the same guy as we continued, he would start telling me that the voices were calling me all kinds of names, that they were telling him not to show up for his appointments, that I was stupid, that I was crazy, not to listen to anything I had to say, and not come in. So I'm getting this feedback from not just him, but several of them. You know, whatever they were, they didn't like me. And I'm still like, well, it could be some part of the subconscious. I don't know what's going on. Whatever it is, it's strange, but I still would not concede that these were separate somethings. You know, I'm still thinking that it's some kind of mental process. Then came reports that the voices were getting very upset with me. And again, this is from a number of these special patients that I'm working with. The voices are really getting pissed off with you. The voices are getting angry at you. They don't want me coming here. They're telling me all this stuff about you. They, you know, so here's these reports coming in. The voices are getting angry with me. And it's like hallucinations are getting angry with me. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You know. Then one day, this first guy who turned in the doorway, he shows up at my office without an appointment, knocks on the door, and he goes, "I got to talk to you." And I didn't have anything going on, just paperwork. So I said, "Come on in, sit down, tell me what's going on." He said, "The voices want to talk to you." And I went, "They want to talk to me personally?" That had never happened before. It was always the patient would tell me what the voices were saying, and I would say something like, "Yeah, go tell them to screw themselves," or something like that. It was always the patient was the intermediary. I had never had them want to talk to me personally, and that kind of took me back. And I'm like, "Whoa, what's going on here?" So I said, "Come on in and have a seat. Tell me what they have to say." And he looks at me, and his voice changes just a little bit, got a little bit deeper. And I said, "What do they have to say?" And he said, these words came out of his mouth: "You have no right to interfere with our way of life." And I'm looking at him like, whoa, it's like I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. That was it. Then my denial system completely collapsed. There was no doubt in my mind now, our way of life, this is plural, this is something else. And then the inmate himself said, "I didn't say that, this came from them."
Mm-hmm.
And it wouldn't make sense that he would say that. So I'm like sitting there going, what just happened, man? And it's like, I was so stunned, I canceled the rest of my appointments for the rest of the day. And it's like, what is going on here? So it was at that point that I knew that I wasn't dealing with just the patient. There was something else going on.
When you say they threatened you, and you said that people said you were in danger, did you experience anything that could be called like psychical attack or anything like that in the time?
Not yet. Not yet. Not at this point. That did come later, and
right.
it got very intense. So we talked about that. I kept working with this guy, knowing now that these things were separate entities. And then I came across that book by Miguel Ruiz, who was talking about them being energy vampires.
Mm-hmm.
And I would bring books in and read them to these guys all the time. Say, "What do you think of this? What do you think of that?" I'd get their opinion. I'd listen to them. I'd talk to them. I'd write down, take notes on what they say. Where psychiatry completely wrote them off. These guys are crazy. They have nothing to say. We're telling them they're crazy. That's the way. That's the end of it. They're crazy. You can't trust anything they say. Don't listen to anything what they say. They're crazy. Just they're crazy. Leave them alone. The only thing you can do is treat them with drugs. And when they found somebody who was actually listening to them and understood, it was like a whole new world for them. It was like somebody really understands for the first time. I could talk to this guy, and if I could give them information that they didn't know about the voices, that was even better. Then they really opened up. It's like, I've had them numerous times say, "How do you know this stuff? I mean, are you crazy also? I mean, are you crazy? That how you know this stuff?" And I'm like, no, you guys told me. So here I bring this book in from Miguel Ruiz, the shaman, who's talking about these things being energy parasites. And I bring it into the guy whose voices told me I have no right to interfere with their way of life. So I bring it out during one of our appointments. And I say, Hey, Mike, I'm going to read you a paragraph out of this. I want you to tell me what you think about this. And what reaction do you have to this? And I started reading it. And when it got to the point where it started talking about these things being energy parasites, he turned into like a zombie. I look up at him, and he's got this glaze over his eyes, and he's just sitting there rigid, just staring at me with this zombie look. And I'm like, uh-oh. I didn't know what was happening. And I'm like, he's going to attack. And I push my chair against the office wall, so if he comes at me, I can kick him back. And, the guards that they put over the medical unit were always females. By the time anything happened, they would be of no use. You're basically on your own.
Right.
So I'm sitting here staring at this guy, and then all of a sudden I heard this loud electrical crackle behind my head, like a arc welder. Mm-hmm. It was like crack, 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 crack. And I'm like looking over there, and I'm looking at this guy who's sitting there like a zombie, and I'm kind of trading my attention between the crackling and this zombie guy looking at me and not knowing what he's going to do. And the thing starts from my back up the right-hand wall, and it's like crack, 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 crack on a 45-degree angle up to the corner of the ceiling. And I'm switching my attention between that and him, thinking that he's going to jump me, but trying to figure out what's going on here. So I'm like back and forth, you know, I'm not wanting to take my eyes off of him, but wanting to see whatever's making that noise. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't smell anything. There was no different taste. It was just that loud electrical crackling like an arc welder. And it goes up to the top of the ceiling, and it starts cutting across the ceiling over his head, so I could see it and him at the same time. But I didn't see anything there. I just heard the sound, that crack, 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 crack. And he's still staring at me like a zombie. And I look at him, I said, "You hear that?" And he's just staring, you know, like this, not moving, just stark still, not answering, nothing. Just, you know, I'm like, what the hell is going on here? And then it starts moving down the left wall, coming toward me now. And I'm like, what is going on here? You know, and it right by my leg, and it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right by my left leg. And I look down in there, and the inmate porter had cleaned that the night before. There was nothing in there, nothing. And I'm hearing this loud crackling come out of there. And then I look at him, and he stands up, and he goes, "I gotta leave." And I'm like, "I can't go, get out of here, go." You know, thinking, get the hell out of here. You know, and he kind of shuffles out the door and starts walking down the hall, and I am like shocked. And I'm like, yeah, thank God he's left. And I'm just in total shock, because if these things could do that, they could also affect physical reality, because they just did. And I couldn't function that day. I just was in shock all that day. I ran out into the hall. I looked at all the other doctors' offices down the way. They were all locked. There was nobody there except me. There was nothing that could have caused that sound. I canceled all my appointments for the rest of the day and just kind of sat there in a daze, like, what am I getting into? You know? I was so frightened that I did not call this guy back for 2 to 3 months. And after about 3 months, I got curious, and I called him back. I had the guards escort him to my office, and closed the door, and I said, you know, he looked good. I thought he would be a wreck. I was surprised that he looked good. He was still doing the kind of things that we were working on. He had the voices somewhat under control. He didn't look as bad as when I first saw him, so he was still working at it. He had not completely gone to the dogs. That shocked me, you know. And he told me he was still doing some of the exercises to keep the voices off. And finally, I got around. And I said, you know, last time you were here, did you hear that crackling in my office? And he said, yeah, I did, but I was surprised you did. He's talking to me. And I said, what was that? And he said, that was them. I said, you mean the voices? He said, yeah. And I said, what were they doing? He said, they were trying to scare you off. And I said, well, they did a damn good job of it. And I said, what were you thinking as you were leaving my office? Because you looked like a friggin' zombie. And he said, I said, what were the voices telling you? And he said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut. And a shank is a kind of prison knife.
Yeah, prison knife.
And I asked him, I said, well, why didn't you do it? You know, thinking, oh, I've been working with this guy for over 6 months. He's not going to do it. And he turns around and looks at me. He goes, because I couldn't find one.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, whoa. There was no doubt in my mind anymore that these were separate entities that were not the individual.
And do you think it was something about being exposed, like you putting the book on the table about them being energy vampires? Because I've heard that from other people, that they do not like being exposed.
Yes, that's what set them off. And what I found after that is, with the patients who were able to hear what I was saying, every single time that I went to point out that these things were energy vampires, they would attack. They would attack the patient, and they would attack me. And after I left after I left the prison, I spent 10 years working psych crisis in the ER emergency rooms. It was then I was able to feel those attacks. They would attack the patient and they would attack me at the same time. And I would experience this icky electrical feeling. And there's no other feeling like it. You know, it's unique to these things attacking you. And I could tell that they were present and how strong they were by how strong that attack was. And some of them were so strong, I was kind of wondering whether they were going to break through. And I wondered what would happen if they did. But they would always, they would consistently attack when I would bring that topic up. They did not like people knowing that. And
yeah, I recall hearing a lecture by a guy called Warren Smith, who felt he came under psychical attack, and he went to get a book from a bookshop, and he found a book in a bookshop about it, and reported the presence of sinister-looking fellow appeared alongside him and said, "Are you going to read that?" in a threatening way. And he felt that these entities were attacking him, didn't want to be exposed. So as soon as he got a book on the thing, then they had control of someone there to warn him off.
Oh, was this just somebody who was walking through the bookstore?
He was specifically looking for a book on the phenomenon of.
But who walked up to him and said, "Are you going to read it?"
It was, as I recall, it was someone who looked like they had mental health issues.
Wow.
And came up as if he was being followed by the. I'll send you the clip on it.
That is very interesting. Yeah, that is the very last thing they want people to know, that they are.
That's when you said it was something about exposure. They really didn't like.
And the reason that is because once people understand that these things are feeding off them, or especially schizophrenics, that changes the whole dynamic of how they view these things. Now it's not them. It's not their mind attacking their mind. It's not them attacking themselves. Now they have an external enemy that they can see. And they don't want, the voices don't want the patient to know that. So there were several patients that told me, they asked their voices, "What are you?" And the voices would respond, "We are you."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They don't want the patient to know that they are different than who they are. As long as they can keep them believing that those thoughts are their thoughts, they can keep sucking negative energy out of them through triggering negative emotions. But once they're viewed as something outside, something separate than the person, that changes the whole dynamic. And the patient a lot of times would get angry when he found out that they were sucking him dry.
Yes.
You know, and now the voices were an enemy. They were a clear enemy. It was no longer the person's mind. It was no longer the person attacking himself. It was no longer the person sabotaging himself. It was no longer these mental processes that he didn't understand. Now the voices he could identify, and they were now a clear enemy, which made it very much harder for the voices to trick them into doing things.
Perhaps it's a good time for me to ask you about how they use deception.
Oh, they will use every deception that they can get their hands on. You know, they will lie about anything. They will cause the patient to perceive things in a totally erroneous manner, especially paranoid schizophrenics. You know, once they got that paranoid process running, the whole world's an enemy. You know, this guy's out to get you. That guy's following you. They're tracking you on satellite. The police are following you. I mean, it's everything is turned against the person.
Okay, I'd like to ask if you've experienced a slightly different angle on the deception thing. Okay, so an analogy would be, I don't know if you have this in Arizona, but where I live, we occasionally get phone calls, and on the other end of the phone, there's a guy who will say, "Hi, my name's Mike, and I work for Microsoft, and you've got a problem on your computer, and I'm here to help you with it." I say, "Oh, thank you, Mike. How helpful of you." And Mike, of course, does not work for Microsoft. Mike is a scammer, and he's trying to get you to download a virus. But if Mike came on and just swore in your ear and said, "Give me your credit card details," you just put the phone down, right? So the whole scam is making the person, a vulnerable person, who perhaps doesn't understand technology, think that Mike's your friend and he's here to help you and he's on your side. And if you follow his instructions, you'll be safe from this external threat of the virus that's infected your computer. Similarly to that, I think the world, and one of the ways it's changing is that we're having this kind of spiritual revolution of
yes, people are waking up.
Being important, people are waking up, okay, and that's bringing with it all sorts of things like the kind of thing that the Society for Psychical Research was investigating back in the 19th century, all sorts of psychical phenomenon, but particularly contact with the what we could call the deceased in some way, or those who are not incarnate, right? And there's discussions, there's people are very sort of cautious about this, but also if this is a valid phenomenon, then it changes the nature of the world we live in, okay? And there's obviously immense therapeutic benefit to people either forming a connection in their own minds with their lost loved ones or through mediumship. And this is the kind of thing that's being investigated. Also, people have the experience of feeling sometimes that they have been deceived by whatever it is they're contacting. And you have this movement of people who become involved in New Age channeling or something, who feel that they're having spiritual knowledge bestowed upon them. And then at some point, it goes bad.
Yes.
Okay? And
they've seen it over and over and over.
Okay. And we've just had the high profile thing. Now, I haven't looked into the details of this, but there's been that famous psychic surgeon in Brazil for all these years, John of God, who has a rusty scalpel and he cuts out tumors by not making an incision. It's all very magical. And now there's a whole scandal erupted. Now, I don't know the specifics of his case, but I've also heard of psychic surgeons over the years that they do all this wonderful work and then something goes horrendously wrong in it. And that there's a dark side to this whole phenomenon. So really my question concerns, well, I just want to know your opinion on that. How can we navigate these waters? Should we navigate them at all? Should we stay away from all kinds of communication with the spirit realm? Or is there a positive in there too?
Again, this goes back to the frequency thing we were talking about earlier. Now, here, I can tell you this for a fact. I have seen scores of patients who started playing with a Ouija board and began getting messages and then started hearing voices. You know, so if you go looking for these things, you know, they will tell you they are some master guru. They will tell you they are some spiritual, somebody who can help you out or not. Yeah, they will tell you anything. You know, you have to be very careful. And there were two cases that I know of. One was a devil worshiper in the prison, and this guy made my skin crawl. I pulled him in because I'd never talked to a devil worshiper before. And he had this strange affect. It was like this howdy-doody affect. And he puzzled me because all the other schizophrenics were depressed and low on energy. And this guy's like bopping along with this strange affect. I don't know how to put my finger on it, but he was like that puppet in the murder movie. I forgot what it was called, but it was kind of like this murderous puppet.
Oh, is it Chucky or something like that?
Yeah. What was it?
Chucky? Is that? I haven't seen the films, but I think it's
something like that. Yeah. And I pulled him in because I was curious. One is, why wasn't he depressed like everybody else? Two, he wasn't on medications and he still wasn't depressed. And you know, three, I'd never spoken to a devil worshiper before. So one question, and he weirded me out. He really did. One question I asked him was, "What does the devil look like?" And his answer was totally unexpected. He said he was beautiful. He said, just absolutely beautiful, radiant, you know. And I'm like, you know, that's not what I was expecting. And then I was reading Jason Quitt, who's another fellow who works in these realms. He was asleep one day and he's able to get out of his body. And in his dream, he was hearing, "Listen, you only have 1 year to live. You've got cancer. You've got 1 year to live." He's hearing this in his dream. So he comes out of his body and to look at what is telling him this. And he said it was a radiant, beautiful being that could have looked like any wonderful angel. I mean, just glowing radiant. And, you know, that surprised him. And he asked the question, are you a being of light? And the thing said, no, I am not. So had he believed what that thing was telling him, he most likely would have got cancer in a year. Yeah. So they can take on any form they want to, including angels, beings of light. You know, the other thing that was very common is schizophrenics who were using drugs, especially amphetamine, which opens people up. I mean, I've seen more patients go psychotic on amphetamine than any other single drug. I mean, it's just like opens the door and says, come in and come in and get, you know. They were telling me over and over now, and a bunch of them would say when they ran out of drugs, the voices would tell them where to go and when to be there, and somebody would show up with that drug. They would also tell them which houses to rob, when to rob them, and roughly where the loot was. You know, so they knew things that the guy himself didn't know. And there was one guy who he told me the voices were telling him which houses to rob, where the loot was, and he had been doing that for a long time. But there was this other house he wanted to rob on his own, and the voices were saying, "I don't do that," and he did it, and he got caught. And I asked him, you know, well, why are you in prison if this is so cool? And he said, I didn't listen to him. So he was telling me one story where he had robbed the house. The voices told him that the people were up and to get out. He got out the window. The voices told him to hide in this trash bin with a thing. He was going to run up this alley to the left. They said, don't do that because the cops are coming up that alley. So they said, go to the right and run into this, get in this trash dumpster. So he went and did that. And the cop walked right by with a flashlight and his gun out, walked right by that dumpster, and just, you know, 15, 20 seconds after he walked by, the voices said, okay, now get up and get out. And he's saying, no, he's right there. He's just right there. I can't get out now. The voice said, get out now, go. Close it quietly and run. He ran back up to his apartment, and the voices said, good job, did a good job. And he said, no, I didn't. I left the loot in the trash can. And he said, well, you go get it tomorrow morning. Yeah. So they would consistently tell them things that they didn't know themselves. And they would appear, in those cases, they appear as friends because the drug addict wants drugs. And these guys are helping them.
Yeah. You see, like, I get that. And there's something about that doesn't scare me, because you can see that, again, on a human level, if some human being is helping someone acquire destructive drugs, they're not really your friend, okay? And that's clear. It's things that I think are more insidious and more scary in some way is when you have, again, on a human level, like a guru gone wrong, some spiritual teacher who projects an image of love and light and then turns out to have narcissistic tendencies, abusive tendencies. And we've seen the whole range of that with the It's been terrible. So, I mean, what you alluded to, the resonance there, okay, and what people say to me about who are engaged in this kind of either channeling or mediumship or something, they'll say that it's like the resonance is the thing. So you have to be of a certain like vibration within yourself. You have to be putting out the good frequencies, and then you won't attract the kind of negativity. But people who go into this, particularly with Ouija boards, people often use Ouija boards looking for a frightening experience. Okay,
well, looking for spirits they communicate with. And what I recently found out within the last couple of months is I had one fellow write me who was using these EVP recording devices, you know, where they listen to ghosts on these devices.
Right. Yes, yeah.
He said that the voices that he heard on that device later moved into him, and now he hears them in his head, and he can't.
Okay.
And he told me, he said, it's not just me. Please get this word out. It's not just me that this is happening to. Warn the public that this is happening to lots of people. And he listed a whole bunch of people that were playing with these devices.
Okay.
that became psychotic.
So what's your thing? I also know people who have done mediumship for maybe like 30 or 40 years and reported it as a positive experience. Okay, so what's your, if someone asked your advice on this, because I know that Emanuel Swedenborg, even though he went into these realms himself a lot, I think basically said, look, you shouldn't really do it because there's a lot of bad entities there and you can get into a lot of trouble. What would your advice be to someone who was thinking about investigating that, either going to a medium or to becoming one or doing channeling? Would it be really that's not a good idea, or would it be?
Yeah, it'd be it's too dangerous. It's just too dangerous. Now I did experience positive ones, because the patients would, I knew they're negative voices, but every once in a while they'd tell me they were hearing a positive voice, which was unusual, but it happened. And one fellow I'd working with, this is the guy who, the fisherman story one that you heard, his mother would come through, and I was suspicious. So if a voice comes through and they're telling me it's positive and they feel it's positive, if it says one negative thing to them about themselves or anybody else, I would regard that voice as a danger, a negative. I wouldn't accept it. In his case, I kept asking him, well, what's your mother say today? What'd your mother say today? Oh, well, put on clean underwear, change your socks, don't hang around the gangsters. It was never anything negative. It was all the stuff that like a mother would say, and I'm kind of keep checking. She didn't say anything negative. No, that's my mother. She's just telling me, because a lot of times they will fake like they're the person's relative.
Yeah.
Especially with people who've been abused very badly. But in his case, the mother would come and she would chase away the weaker voices, but when the stronger ones would come, she would run. And he did succeed. We got rid of the voices for him and he returned to a normal life. He never heard him again. And his mother came through at the end and he said, my mother wants to talk to you. And I'm like, well, what's she want to say? She said, thank you for helping my son. And I said, well, you're very welcome, because over months she had never said anything negative. She had never given him any bum advice. And I asked her, I said, well, what are you doing over there? She said, I'm checking people in. She was like a secretary. And I went to ask her another question and she said, everything you need to know is in the Bible. I shouldn't be talking to you. And that was the end of that. But a lot of times they will fake like they're good until they hook you, and then they will start turning bad. So that's a hook.
Yes.
Oh yeah, you're interested in psychic stuff. You're interested in the spiritual world. Well, let me give you some of that. Here, we can. Here, let's watch this. We'll do this. I'm telling you this. Watch out for that guy. And once they got you, then they got you. Now you're listening to them. You're paying attention to them, and they feed off of that attention. They have to get your attention first before they can, start draining you. So that's why Sherry's program. So she said that's a lie. That breaks that attention. Yes. They can't get your attention. Now, if they can bring down a preacher, boy, that's 50 points for them. So if they can bring down a guru or a preacher or one of those guys, that's like, they get a bonus for that.
So let me move on then and ask you about the ultimate nature of the voices, because different people have presented different perspectives on this. Okay, so in Buddhism, you get the concept of the hungry ghost. Okay, the soul that leaves the body and it doesn't quite maybe realize it's dead, and it staggers around and tries to do what it did on Earth. It goes and gets drunk at the pub, and you have this also in we mentioned the book 30 Years Amongst the Dead. I think it was Carl Wickland presents that view too, that the entities him and his wife were encountering didn't always come across as bad or negative. More so, they were confused sometimes. Right. They were like, no, I'm not dead. This is my body. I'm in this body. And then they would look at the body. It's a woman's body. You're a man. So how am I in a woman's body? And they'd help the entity go off and meet its family in the light then. And then you have the more Christian concept of demons and real malevolence and this coming through. And then, of course, we have sitting just off to the side, we have the whole UFO experience now. And where does that slot into this? So do you feel beyond them being energetic vampires, intentional or otherwise, do you feel you gained insight into what's going on there in terms of what these beings are and what they're about?
Well, you're right on with that. Not all of them are demonic energy suckers, but if they're in there, like a lot of times the mother will come back and visit the daughter, and be telling her this and telling her that, and even though she is not destructive, intentionally, she is messing the person up. Yeah. They are messing her energy up and messing her life up. They don't belong there. I remember 2 cases I spoke to with people who were hearing voices, and this was a time where I was actually speaking to the voices. And I asked this one. It was the guy was a prisoner. He was driving a motorcycle at the time when the voices first started. And I asked the voice. I said, "What gives you the right to be here?" And he said, "Well, I was driving a motorcycle on the highway and I was killed. My motorcycle was destroyed and I was roaming around, didn't know where to go. And I saw this other motorcycle rider, so I just jumped into him."
Right.
That was a patient. There was another one where the voice said, I asked him, what did you experience right before you're dead? And he said, I was standing next to a car and I heard 3 pops. And the next thing I know, I was on the ground. So apparently he was the victim of a shooting. So these voices weren't, they were, like you said, they were lost souls. They didn't belong there. They screwed up the people they were in. They didn't know what else to do. The most dastardly ones, and the ones that make my skin still crawl, are the ones where the psychotic patient, a lot of times they're girls, were badly sexually and physically abused by their father or a relative. And it was a horrific life with them. And finally, that relative died. And they're like relieved. They're like, finally, he's dead. And next thing they know, they're hearing a voice saying, "I'm back. You can't get rid of me that easily. I'm back again." And that's not the father. That's another entity that knows that if he can get in there and convince this person that the father is plaguing her after death, that's going to generate a ton of negative emotional energy. So for that person, I mean, that's like hell on earth. Not only did they go through the living hell while that guy was alive, now he's dead and he's still plaguing them.
So does this change the way you might interact with the voice from a treatment sense then? Because as I mentioned in Carl Wickland's voice, it's very much a voice in Carl Wickland's work, 30 Years Amongst the Dead. It's very much a sense of a healing for both the individual and the spirit, say, in terms of getting the spirit to realize that, no, you're in the wrong body. You need to go to your family in the light. Can you see someone in the light waiting for you? And is that no? Oh yes, my mother's there. So if they're a lost ghost, say, then that's one thing. I've also heard you in other interviews mention the idea of telling entities that were malevolent in some sense to move towards the light, or that there was light within them, okay, and to reconnect with that. And they've been told there wasn't, and the only thing they could do now was to play out this role of victimizer, okay? And then I wonder where you get into more malevolent, again, things that, whatever they are, might appear demonic or just purely evil. Is there a different way of dealing with them? How does the different kind of the nature of the entity affect the way you might interact with them for the purpose of healing?
Yeah, the nature of the entity makes a big difference how you interact with them. While I was working in the prison for a while before these guys started recovering, and the voices were gone and they didn't need the medications anymore. And I thought that, the administration would be happy about that, but that same chief psychologist who made me stop handing out the rubber bands in 23rd Psalm, he was freaked out over this. When he found out that these guys were recovering, I faced an inquisition. I got pulled up in front of the medical director. What are you doing? You're experimenting with prisoners without permission. You know, you're going to get fired. You know, I thought they'd be happy. It was the opposite. It was the friggin' opposite. They were pacing like, you know, they had ants in their pants or something.
Do you think they were affected by the voices themselves?
Well, I think they were affected by something negative. I mean, both of them. Why wouldn't you be happy if schizophrenics who you're spending hundreds of dollars a month on to give medicines no longer need some medicines? You know, why wouldn't that be a boon? You know, but it did fly in the face of what psychiatry is saying is these people cannot be cured. There is no cure. You know, they're going to need medications for the rest of their lives. It flew in the face of administration and the establishment. And when they started asking these guys, pulling them aside, I mean, they were actually asking them questions. What is he doing in there with you? None of them told them anything because they knew what they were doing. One guy said, he's helping us, not like you, shithead. That set him off, boy. He could have gone all day without saying that. So the psychologist who was doing the investigation said, okay, we have a valid MMPI on you showing the results when you first got in, which showed that the guy was psychotic. He said, would you be willing to take another one? And the patient, the inmate said, yeah, I'll be willing to do that. So he did. He took another one, and it showed that he was no longer psychotic, and it was a valid profile. That drove them nuts. You know, that's like, this is their coup de grace. This is their chief instrument that they use for everything. And you know, so there was a while where I could talk to the voices and I could spend some time working with them. But when I got into the ER, all they want you to do is push them through, get them out of there.
Yeah.
You know, even open the beds, get them out, you know, get more patients in, just keep the revolving door going. So I had to be very careful about which patients I chose to give this information to, and I didn't have very much time to do it. You know, so I would give it to them, and sometimes I would send them to, I would admit them to the hospital if they needed medicines, because the medicines, even though they're rotten, they do bring down the voices to a level where these people can start working with these concepts. Without the meds, you couldn't touch them. The voices would be way too loud. They'd be way too strong. So, and there's a number of them. I waited till they were on meds before I started giving them this information. But during the time I was in the prison and talking to the voices, yeah, you could do that with the ones that, even some of the ones that were malevolent, because they had been, you'd ask them, well, you've been told that you don't have any light in you, and that if you don't do what you were told to, you would cease to exist. That's what they were told. And these are the foot soldier guys.
Okay.
You know? Yeah, there was one where I was talking to the voice and said, okay, you were told there's no light in you. And he said, that's right. I said, well, okay, let's go look. So I'd imagine us going looking. I said, do you see it yet? No, I don't see it. We go, you see it yet? Well, I see a very dim orange light. And I said, but you were told you didn't have any light in you. And they got mad. I was surprised. It got mad, you know? And so we went down and imagined, okay, let's go down to the light. And I imagined we're standing next to the light. And I said, stick your hand in there. You go, no, it'll burn me. I said, no, it won't. Stick your hand in there. And it sticks its hand in there. And I said, it's not burning you, is it? Most of the time, it was, you know, almost 99% of the time, no, it's not hurting me. I had one say, oh, yeah, it's burning me. I said, no, it's not. You know, and he stuck it in again. It wasn't burning him. I said, okay, walk into the light. And walk in the light. And then I said, okay, now let's call for some of your relatives to come and take you out of here. You know, you can't go back to the way you were, because if they get caught, they're punished.
Yeah.
If they get caught speaking to me, they're punished. You know, so if he goes back, their guys over them tell them they're going to go to the pit, wherever the pit is, but wherever it is, it's not a nice place.
Mm-hmm.
So if they get caught speaking, they get caught doing what they're doing, they go to this pit. If they don't work actively at destroying the person, they get thrown at that pit. So some of them don't really want to destroy the person, so they do a poor job and they're taken out and sent to wherever this place is, this pit thing. This guy called his grandmother, and his grandmother came through and was there. I said, do you see him yet? And he said, I see my grandmother. And I said, do you trust your grandmother? He goes, yeah, I trust my grandmother. I said, well, go with her, because you know what's going to happen if you go back there. You know, they're waiting on you. You're going to go to the pit, wherever that is. So he'd go.
Okay.
And that voice was gone. Now, that didn't get rid of all of them, but it got rid of that one. You know, and there was one time I was working in that same vanner where that one disappeared, and I thought that was it. And then the patient said, no, there's another one, and this one's stronger. And I said, well, where'd that one come from? And he said, that's it. That's the other one's boss. So there's some kind of hierarchy there where the higher ones are deceiving the lower ones into believing that if they don't destroy us, that they will cease to exist. It's almost like what's going on in the real world with the Federal Reserve and the bankers. I mean, it's, as above, so below.
Well, yeah, I'd like to ask you about the real world kind of stuff in a minute and the wider implications, but just let me ask, has this whole experience left you with an overarching kind of narrative of what it's all about concerning good and evil? Okay, so there's these lower ones, and then they're acting in an evil way, but they're not inherently evil. Then you maybe go up to the mid-level and there's a hierarchy. Do you get any impression of what's going on there? Are we living in this dualistic world where there's this unreconcilable evil? Or
I think, it's like the cartoons where you see the devil and the angel on each shoulder, but the devil can speak in words, and the angel, for the most part, only speaks in feelings and intuition.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So you're doing something wrong, and you shouldn't be doing it wrong, that it feels bad, very seldom do the positive ones speak in words. And the only time I really saw them speak in words are the number of schizophrenics who, almost all of them, attempt to commit suicide at some point. And that generates a ton of negative emotional energy. And the voices are telling them, yeah, do it. You're worthless. You're no good. You're a burden on everybody. Kill yourself. Just get it over with. It generates a ton of negative emotional energy. And they feed on that. What I never fully understood is that the ones who kill themselves, now they're no longer a food source for that entity. So I still don't understand that. Why would they have their food source kill themselves? But the vast majority attempt it, and that generates a ton of negative emotional energy. And I got some stories of the positive ones where things happened that they attempted to kill themselves, and a number of miraculous things happened.
Amazing how often you hear that.
them.
Yeah, it's incredible how often you hear that. So has the whole investigation inclined you to any particular religious view? And the reason I ask this is, I hear a lot of testimonies from people who have got, as I mentioned before, gotten into New Age channeling or something, felt like they've encountered something deceptive and dark, and then become quite hardcore Christians as a result of the experience, and they've called upon Jesus, say. And I've also had people tell me they've gone the other way, where I was talking to a fellow recently who was a Christian and investigated demonology and exorcism and such things, and saw that the demons had the demons seemed to be believing Christianity themselves, and there'd be all this thing like they would knock 3 times, okay, to make a mockery of the Trinity, and a lot of Christian overlay. And then he started investigating other cultures, and saw that the negative entities, the vampires, took on the overlay of that culture when they were tormenting people there. So his conclusion was that they know our religions, and they play on what scares us. They'll dress up in whatever the scary image in our religion is. And as I mentioned before, we have UFO experiences now too, where people are taken, tormented sometimes, and sometimes have blissful experiences with them. So has the whole experience inclined you to a particular worldview, or do you see it more based around whatever it is that's positive and whatever is negative is what's going to have the effect?
Oh no, there's, you can't experience these kind of things without having your worldview just completely shaken to the core.
Sure.
And I think the single most dangerous idea in the Christian religion is that we are born evil.
Right.
Because once you buy into that, you adopt that and you become that. It's a very dangerous thought. What these things have to affect you is language. You look at a dog's happy, it runs around all the time, it runs into a difficult situation, it blows it off, and after it's over, it's back to being happy again. Dogs don't have that thought that's running around in their head all the time, going, this is what's happening, that's what's happening. You have this wall of thought that is controlled by most religions to the religion's benefit. And you look at the Catholic religion and the ritual and the amount of money that the Vatican has, and the child sexual abuse, and I mean, it's rotten to the core. And yet you have millions and millions of, it owns more land than any other private corporation on the planet. It's richer than any other religion, and it's all based on sin and go to church and give money, and you look into its history, and the history of the Catholic Church is just horrifying. I mean, it's just horrifying. It's all control. And a lot of churches are like that. The one that I found wasn't like that were the Swedenborgian churches, where they teach Emanuel Swedenborg. That's the only one I've found that doesn't seem to have a pushing an agenda. They'll give you the information, they'll talk about it. They have groups, they have programs, and the teaching of Swedenborg in and of itself. I mean, heaven and hell should be standard reading for everybody. Emanuel Swedenborg's, it'll tell you more about how heaven and hell work than I'm even, well, probably not as much, because he didn't go as much into the dark side as I did. But it gives you a layout of how it all works. And he'll take you deeper, deeper, deeper until you get into Secrets of Heaven, which is just, you sit there and read 3 pages of that, and you're like, oh, it's like plodding through mud. It's like, whoa, you can't just read those concepts lightly. Where with Heaven and Hell, I picked that up, and I don't know how many pages it is. It's about that thick. I finished that off. I couldn't put it down. I finished it off in about 3 days. I read until I couldn't read anymore.
Right.
So they have Off the Left Eye, which is a Swedenborgian program done by Curtis and Karen Childs. And it's an easy way to learn the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. You just sit there in front of your TV, and they'll teach you.
Okay. Well, I'll link to that in the box below, whatever people are looking at this on. My final question, Jerry, is, as soon as we acknowledge the existence of these things on an individual level, that they're affecting the level of individual people's thoughts, which is what we've been discussing here, some big questions arise that we then can't ignore. Okay, so we then have to ask, well, what effect are these entities having on group levels? Okay, and that group could be something the size of a small cult, or a big cult, or a nation state, right? And then you've got to ask, well, okay, when we look at history, we look at history as being human history and what humans have done throughout history, and other factors thrown in like the climate and so on, but that's how we look at history. We don't have history books, apart from some very fringe material. We don't have history books that talk about including the role of these vampiric entities, whatever they are. So you started off mentioning right at the start the Kennedy assassination, okay? And I mentioned George Bush, and 9/11 was another big thing for me about that. So when we're talking then about the effect they have, we could talk about this on the level of if politicians and people in positions of power are being fed negative information through voices, that might affect their actions on an immediate level. So are the voices, are the entities, the vampiric entities, looking to create negative conditions for a wider scope of people through politicians?
Yes.
And if we ask that question, well, look, they're in a world that we're not. So as where, you know, humanity, we don't really plan things 100 years ahead. Sometimes people have big ideological movements that play out over maybe a century, okay, like big imperial projects like the British Empire or something, or so on. But typically, we're limited to maybe a 30-year plan. We look to the length of our own career at most. But who knows how time works if you're looking at the world from the outside looking in. So if they're planning events out like wars, well, are they planning the rise and fall of empires? Do they have a 100-year plan? Do they have a 1,000-year plan? And these questions suddenly become unavoidable, I think. And I wonder, I appreciate that it's an impossible question to perhaps answer, but what are your thoughts on these entities and a longer term plan for humanity?
Well, what has to be kept in mind is that these things want to keep the hog trough full. They want to generate, I mean, they want an unending stream of negative emotional energy on which to feed. And if you look, you go 2,000 years back in the Bible, and the Bible's talking about these entities. They're talking about evil spirits possessing these guys, you know. But it's almost like science these days are going, yeah, well, you know, the Bible's, that they're not real entities. And you talk to Christian Science and they say, oh, no, that's not what they mean. It's almost like they're writing that part out. You know, it's half the equation. I mean, there's good spirits, you know, and you can communicate with good spirits, and they communicate back by serendipity, things that happen. You know, like a guy pulls in front of you, ask a question, a guy pulls in front of you with a license plate that says this, but you have to learn to begin to, how to read that. You know, nature's always speaking to you. They're always speaking to you. You know, hawks around here, when I see a hawk circling overhead and I'm thinking about something, that's an affirmation as far as I'm concerned. But these things don't care about the human race except as a feeding trough. And you look at what's happening. The wars, the constant wars throughout human history, wars and more wars, cruelty, wars. You look at now, it's the same thing. They want to keep that feeding trough going. They want an unending supply of negative emotional energy. And the information like we're talking about here is a very big threat to them. Matter of fact, I'm surprised that the electronics hasn't gone out yet, because almost every other lecture I've done, something happened with the electronics to interfere. Either
Right.
sound would go out or we'd lose contact. I mean, this is the first one I've had in a long time where the electronics hasn't.
Let's not count chickens, we're not there.
Something weird, you know. But yeah, that's the bottom line. They could care less. We are cows to them, and that's all we are to them. Yeah.
And did you, I mean, again, I appreciate I'm asking probably impossible questions, but it's just an interesting way to round off. I mean, you mentioned that you had some communication with an active Satanist, right? Which, you know, I've never met anyone like that.
I have communication with who?
A Satanist, so in the prison, someone who was an active Satanist.
Oh, I just pulled him in, yeah, for one meeting, and that's all I wanted to talk to him for.
So do you get, like, when you, like, if I'm thinking about people who have spoken about entities influencing the world, they'll also write about it being a two-way street, okay? That certain elite leaders are not just unconsciously being influenced, but are in conscious connection with, in what we could call some kind of Satanism, or some, like they're in their positions of power because they've promised to do a certain work for these vampiric beings, the archons, and that's why they're moved into them. Do you have any sense of that? Or?
Yeah, you look at the three things that these things attack people on, you know, greed, lust, and fear.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the three things. So these guys in the central banks, you know, all three of those, you know, greed and lust for sure. And, you know, preachers, I mean, you know, they'll go after those aspects and keep chinking away and until the person gives in. So a preacher might have a parishioner who's, you know, pretty and hitting on him, and you know, they're saying, hey, well, you know, go ahead, nobody will find out. Yeah. You know, maybe the Catholic Church, you know, nobody will believe a priest is molesting anybody. I mean, go ahead. You know, one thing that the patients have told me is that these things are relentless. They don't let up. They go 24 hours a day. Every chance they get. Once they feed, so after an attack, once they feed, they back off for a while, and they allow the patient, like we allow a cow to go out to the pasture and eat more grass to generate more energy. Now, the only way they can use it is if they take it and turn it negative. So that's where all the negative, and you look at the TV, you turn on the TV, you know, it's like, hey, drug yourself. You don't have to solve any problems. Here's these multi-billion-dollar drug companies, these people sitting there dreaming up these illnesses, and then the drug companies coming up behind them saying, oh yeah, we got a chemical that'll fit that, you know. You look at, they turn on the news, it's all negative. You turn on the stations, here's horror movies and murders. And how many times has a teenager seen somebody be shot on television before he picks up a gun and goes shoot somebody else? You know, it's constant negativity. The news is constantly negative. There's constant wars, there's constant conflict. And it's all because of that, the influence on the thinking. If you could get to the point where those thoughts are not yours, you're the consciousness, you're the awareness behind those thoughts, you know? And that's a wall that stops you from understanding that you're just pure consciousness, you know, who you are, taking away all these senses. You're just this awareness that is affected by all this crap, you know. And that keeps you away from who you really are.
Thanks for listening, everyone. I thought that was a good spot to cut the main body of the interview. Do remember there are several bonus clips where Jerry goes into more detail on certain areas. Very happy to receive comments and feedback on this, as Jerry has offered to come back on the show himself. And in addition to that, I'll be having other people on to offer a, in some ways, complementary, in some ways, contrasting perspective. And if you want to be informed of that, you can either subscribe on whatever platform, or there's a link to a mailing list you can sign up to below. Thanks again.